My name is Jeremy Cohen. I'm a graduate student here at NYU, and I'm the New York City coordinator for Platypus Affiliated Society, which is a group that, for those of you who don't know, and for those of you who do, a group that has educational events of all kinds on left-wing politics, including weekly reading groups, public discussions, panels, book chats like we're doing today, and many more things. Please, there's free. We also publish a regular newspaper. It's up at the table in front. Everything is free, you see there, so please check us out. There's a mailing list to find out about our New York events. I thank you for joining us. I know this is finals time. I think that's why we're suffering a bit of audience shortage, but I look forward to the intensity of the discussion to make up for the lack of bodies. And I would like to welcome with great pleasure Professor Richard Wolin for what I hope is the first in a long series of productive engagements. He is a professor at CUNY Graduate Center. He's been very gracious in coming out here today. He just came back from a trip abroad in Denmark and taught a class today. So we really appreciate he's here. He is the author of many books, the most recent of which, and most relevant to today, is a book called The Wind from the East. As a subtitle, doesn't it? French Intellectuals, the Cultural Revolution, and the Legacy of the 1960s. It's a mouthful. And so that will be the primary topic of discussion today. The book's just come out in paperback, and there's a preview copy up front as well as order forms for those who would like to pick up a copy. Other than that, Professor Wolin has authored many, many other books. He edited a book called The Heidegger Controversy. He's written books Heidegger's Children, Hannah Arendt, Karl Lewin, Hans Jonas and Marcuse. That's right. And the Seduction of Unreason, the intellectual romance with fascism from Nietzsche to postmodernism. And broadly, I think Professor Wolin's work has been on sort of the odd fortunes of the political left over the course of the 20th century, or the intellectual political left over the course of the 20th century. So without further ado, I know Professor Wolin, you wanted to start in with some introductory comments about sort of left-wing politics today. So.
That's okay.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I did ask Jeremy.
I just wanted to say one thing to them about format. We're going to talk here for about 30 to 45 minutes, just kind of talking to Professor Wolin about his books, and then we'll open it up so there's plenty of time for discussion. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this, and thank you for coming out. I did request the format, as Jeremy suggested, it would be a book talk, and I have this fear that it's great to do book talks and discussion. It's something I worked on for a period of years, but I know that our intention was to segue to contemporary politics and left-wing politics and current challenges. And I always have this feeling or fear that the most important stuff never gets left out. So I figured it'd be good to start with some of those issues and see if they reemerge in the context of talking about the book, which is more of a historical focus, less contemporary focus. But I thank you again for having this idea, because I think that you sense that the book, which was written a couple of years ago, does have contemporary political implications and was written with an eye to issues of contemporary politics. And indeed, that was the case. But I just want to say that, we actually have, as Jeremy said, I've actually just come back from Europe, where I was in France and Denmark, and we have this, there was a phrase when the first socialist president was elected in France, François Mitterrand, back in 1981. It's a really interesting story, but not our story tonight. But curiously, very important, it was a very close race with the previous incumbent, Giscard d'Estaing, and Mitterrand, after having barely lost to Giscard d'Estaing in 1974, triumphed, and there is a thinking that it was the gay vote that put him over the top, because there were still on the books draconian laws from earlier in the century about consensual relations between adults, And the socialists had already addressed this in their campaign. And indeed, one of the first pieces of legislation that the socialists passed was to have these laws removed from the books. So there was there was a slogan that was chanted throughout the streets of Paris in the aftermath of Mitterrand's victory. And it was something to have a socialist president of the Fifth Republic, even if he was a person or a man without a left-wing past. He under the story. Yeah, under Vichy, he'd been awarded by Marshal Pétain the highest award for service to the Vichy regime, the Francisque, in 42 or 43. Be that as it may, so the celebration, in good French shoulder-to-shoulder style after his victory, the slogan was, then the term of office, Chirac changed it because he would have been too old when he ran again in 2002, to 5 years, but of course it used to be 7 years. So the slogan was, through the streets of Paris, especially the gay contingent, which was very happy, 7 ans de bonheur, 7 years of happiness. Well, it turned out to be 14 years, and it wasn't all happiness. But, who's going to quibble over that or nitpick? But so now I'm wondering if it's, the expectations are certainly toned down. It's 5 years, whatever. And it's an important phenomenon to reflect on. The last 2 weeks in Europe, we've had a government fall in Romania because of austerity. We have had a no-confidence vote in the Netherlands 10 days ago, which has a center-right coalition with the rather nasty at times anti-immigrant, anti-Islam Geert Wilders and the Freedom Party. We've had their austerity budget voted down. Sarkozy was removed from office yesterday, so there's hope for François Hollande. And there's a sense in the air. There's a new forms of horizontal democracy. One could point to perhaps beginning in Argentina, a year ago in Spain, where there's 50% youth unemployment, 25% general unemployment. This is a horror. This is, totally unanticipated, unexpected turn of events. The 15th May movement of the squatters in Madrid and elsewhere in Spain, there are percolating signs of protest and revolt. But the point I want to make, all of these phenomena need to be heeded and taken into account. But this is actually a very difficult crossroads, I think. For the left, I don't even know for sure if it's still meaningful to speak of the left in a sense that counts, insofar as I'm just going to mention a couple of examples here that I think are significant, and then if you get back to them, fine, and you want to talk about them, fine. I mean, I'm sticking for now a bit with a European context. But it's a fact that it was labor politicians or socialist politicians or Mitterrand himself, who underwent a volte-face, a change of course in 83, 84, expelled the communists from his government, the ruling coalition. Well, actually, they left when he pursued a policy of liberalization, marketization, went on TV singing the virtues of the entrepreneurial way, in many ways, going 180 degrees against the program that he promised when he reshaped the French Socialist Party in the early 70s. One could say the same, of course, very much the same for the Labour Party in Britain under Tony Blair, and much the same thing for the German Social Democrats in the late 90s and early 2000s. So I think there needs to be a total reconceptualization. I mean, I'm not the only one who's suggested this, of the focus, purport, and meaning of the left. And I think part of the equation is very simple. I think that until the structure of industrial society changed very radically in the last 3 or 4 decades toward the service industry, toward high-tech industries, or whatever you want to call them, the working class, the traditional backbone of left-wing politics, that achieved, through its pressures, many important and meaningful reforms over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century, and then finally the solution out of embarrassment in response to fascism after World War II, the creation of a meaningful social state or welfare state in the aftermath of World War II in Britain, with the Labour government that succeeded Churchill, the Beveridge Plan, etc. There's still a powerful, solidary working class constituency that can be relied on. The French socialist constituency since Mitterrand and since the 70s has been what one might call, salaried employees, white-collar workers, salariés, professors, managers, people who are more educated, etc. There's really no working class base there. They were attracted by the communists. The communists have fallen off the meaningful electoral table or chart for several decades now. Some of the vacuum or political response or representation has been assumed by the far right, by the National Front. Obviously, the issues, the political horizons are blurred, and there are issues that of protectionism, cultural protectionism, economic protectionism, that vis-a-vis globalization, vis-a-vis the EU, that is a concern to the working class that's left of it, and these concerns are not being addressed by the political class or the technocrats or the graduates of the Grande École, the elite institutions that produce France's political class these days, or intended to do so. That's just one example. So I think there's a lot that needs to be rethought. There's also the phenomenon of cultural emancipation and the phenomenon of a type of left-wing identity politics that's been important and gained a hearing. And in France, they have parité, the requirement that there is a certain measure of gender equity, at least with the Socialist Party. This is mandated by them. But you can see also the issues have fragmented. They're no longer focused on the wage labor capital dyad opposition. So you have multiple and variegated constituencies. So it's much harder to form and keep together coalitions and focus in some kind of unified challenge.
Maybe we can actually use that as a transition to the book, because that's actually a theme, it seems to me, that comes up a lot in the book when we're talking about the kind of the new character of May 68. And the interesting relationship of the Maoists, who tended to actually be relatively orthodox, ouvriériste, characters when confronted with May 68. So maybe you want to, because it seems to me that story in your account sort of starts around the May 68 period.
Right. Yeah.
You want to talk about how that?
Yeah. No. I'll just talk about it briefly. We can see where it goes, because you're right. That was probably a good moment to segue from my monologue to some transition that I bring up in the book, whereby these kind of Maoists from the École Normale largely call themselves the proletariat left, the gauche prolétarienne, who identified profoundly with China, so profoundly they wouldn't even kind of go into the streets in May 68 because they thought this was student revolt they didn't want to have anything to do with, because they thought of themselves as les purs et les durs. Of course, they were students too. They were nomadiens. So that was the difference of sorts. But they blew it in May 68. The revolt that protest that has by mid-May a general strike with 50% of the French population, 10 million people in the streets, causing the president of 10 years, Charles de Gaulle, to flee. to Germany to make sure the troops were loyal in case he had to call them. We really don't know why he fled. But he did flee, and he didn't tell anyone where he went. And it was quite spectacular in this respect. So, but the story I tell is how this group of very dogmatic Maoists, and talk about what the attractions of Mao and the Cultural Revolution might have been for them. The way they did it, they did sessions in good Maoist fashion in the summer of '68, after May, sessions of self-criticism as to how they so drastically misjudged the potential for collective resistance, and gradually over the course of the next year and a half, they achieved a measure of solidarity with some of the more, what you might call, libertarian or libidinal currents of the student left, who became interested in social movements. So one of the curiosities, one of the little narratives I tell, actually it's important, is the way that despite the Marxist rhetoric of the left-wing students in May, which was always peculiar because in a way I describe it as that the student demands were always very moderate and modest. There was no attempt to seize power. Despite there was this contradiction between the traditional French revolutionary rhetoric of getting on the barricades, and barricades were erected, of course, in the Latin Quarter, and the attempt to reenact the heroic phases that we might grow up. Those of you who were schooled in the United States with images, I don't know, Washington crossing the Delaware, or whatever. Well, for them, it's the storming of the Bastille and the Revolution of 1848 and the Paris Commune. And if you're going to be French and inherit this political legacy, this is the glorious tradition that you have to reenact. But they had to, and then Jacobinism and Robespierre fused with Bolshevism in 1917. This is the allegedly the heir to the tradition of revolutionism, the inadequacies and insufficiencies that bourgeois revolution will be fulfilled via a socialist revolution. Well, that makes perfect sense from a certain lineage or direction of counting. But that didn't really measure up to the realities of all the issues, different kinds of issues that had come up concerning authoritarianism and mores, bureaucracy, hierarchy, sexual equality, etc., the society of consumption. There's a whole other discourse having to do with the situationists and Henri Lefebvre, the arguments group, argument, having to do with the critique of everyday life. So there was a pact of sorts after 68, 69, 70, kind of a merger between the Maoists and some of the anarchists from Nanterre, Cohn-Bendit, and other groups that resulted in the Sacre Bleu, the emergence, in fact, of French feminism, the Mouvement Libération des Femmes, came out of really a Maoist group and offshoot, as did Gay Liberation in France, the Homosexual Front for Revolutionary Action, or FAR is the French acronym, and Guy Hockenghem, who's, I think, known in, maybe not, in the US, died of AIDS in the mid-'80s, for his book Homosexual Desire, who's really the first person in quite a public venue to come out, but how do you factor out, how do you reconcile this with, French, the culture is very left-wing and Marxist during the 60s. Well, the whole paradigm shifts and the purview of critique and revolution and contestation shifts in the direction, it's not that dissimilar from what happened in the United States either, obviously, in the direction of social movements and questions of cultural, the whole notion of cultural revolution was redefined away from the Maoist point of reference, which by then had been identified as a debacle for various reasons. People who had been sent down, memoirs had filtered out through Hong Kong and been translated to English and French. So it was pretty clear by then that Maoism, once it stays safely 8,000 miles away, you don't know the language, and it's essentially a closed society. You get Potemkin village tours, even if you go there, as many of the students did. It's easy just to make it, as I argue in the book, it's a projection screen for all your frustrated revolutionary fantasies and
China
Imposed.
had,
Right, right. China.
rather than
Yeah.
China that exists.
Right.
So, I mean, I feel like there's a lot there. Maybe we can start with sort of, because I do think in the book you describe something like a sort of convergence between something that, they end up, the sort of nature of their critiques are very different. The Maoists and the anarchist critique of broadly the PCF and the sort of Stalinist legacy. So I wonder why, if you could describe a little more what the sense was of the failures of Bolshevism and communism, and why these two different tacks were taken, and how bizarrely they ended up sort of converging after a while.
Yeah. Well, one of the conclusions I arrived at after kind of beginning this project, and some was based on just kind of intuitive knowledge of the situation, but the left often these days in France and Germany, elsewhere, was so factionalized that it really demanded the skills of a good anthropologist or ethnographer to really decipher what was happening, what the nature of the significant disagreements were. But the Maoist position is paradoxical. I mean, to speak in broad terms, well, of course, there was Khrushchev's 20th Party Congress speech denouncing 56, denouncing the crimes of the Stalin era. So from the standpoint of, this was very threatening to Mao. Now I'm the real Mao, not the substitutes in France during the late 60s. This was very threatening because the lineage of Chinese communism, which only vanquished Kuomintang as of 49, was based on the lineage of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. So when you start de-Stalinization, this is a threat to Mao. So the Maoist critique, I mean the real Maoists, not the fake ones in the Latin Quarter, was that, of course, Khrushchev was a revisionist. And talk of peaceful coexistence was heresy and ideological treason from the standpoint of communism. So for the Maoists, the Soviet Union wasn't Stalinist enough. It should have remained Stalinist in some, imaginary conceptual sense. But obviously but you can't reconcile. This is kind of the point I want. And of course, the French Communist Party, which during the first elections after the war, after the liberation in '44, because of the prestige of as résistants, were the largest vote getters in the post-war elections. And as you know, probably they maintained until the 80s a percentage of 20%, sometimes higher, in national elections. They were very comfortable to become kind of an institutional party. Yeah, an institutional party, well ensconced in the system of the Fourth and then the Fifth Republic, which was a real knock against them from the standpoint of students who were interested in contestation. So you really, it was a party run by septuagenarians, and this was impossible to reconcile with the prevalent cultural air of youth culture and youth revolution. Just didn't go together. They were losing recruits among prestigious intellectuals for a long time. So there was a search for a new political currency, and this is, I think, why for many Godard made this film that maybe many of you have seen. One made a number, La Chinoise in '67 already, because he was fascinated with Chinoise, things Chinese. This is, again, my fear is that the most important ideas or observations get left unsaid. It was just a classical case of Orientalism. A continuous trope in French history at various phases, and Western history as well. And it was a form of repetition compulsion in this respect that fascinates me with China and its possibilities. And of course it was the radicals in the Cultural Revolution as of '66, when Mao unleashed the Cultural Revolution. The Red Guards were students. Mao suspended universities and high schools and let the students out so they could hunt down bourgeois roaders and reactionaries who had lost their radicality, and it resulted in pitched battles between the Red Guards and the army at times for just control of cities and universities. But for French students, the fact that there were student revolutionaries, the fact that Mao was sort of a philosopher, at least he wrote, and he wrote poetry, and did calligraphy. Well, Cultural Revolution, where do we sign up?
And then what about the anarchist critique? How did that end up moving the Maoists? Because you talk about the socialism of Barbary and the Guy Debord, etc. So maybe you want to go into that a little bit.
Yeah, well, the student leader of May '68, there were really four. But Cohn-Bendit, who just came out about 5 days ago as a deputy to the European Parliament from, he's going back and forth between France and Germany. He's has had dual citizenship, and at one point he was prevented from re-entering France in May '68 because he'd gone to Germany for a while. But he was but his background was in anarchism, and he was the student leader of Nanterre, where May '68 first broke out, and deserves a lot of credit for making sure it was a self-limiting revolution, and having the students operate with one of the cliches about May '68 is that no one died in May, which, as far as cliches go, is true, nevertheless. So it was actually a fairly sober and self-limiting set of demands and requirements under his leadership and the leadership of several others, the head of the students' organization, Union of French Students, and an important Trotskyist representative as well, and then Krivine. So one of the arguments I make, and it's really not original, that one of the remarkable outcomes or turns of events in May '68 is that this kind of marginal left-wing discourse that was produced by small journals with a very limited circulation. You mentioned the key names, Socialisme ou Barbarie, founded by Castriatus and Codefort, 1949, where self-management or autogestion, critique of the state, critique of bureaucratic communism, etc., was central. The Situationists International with their critique of everyday life, urbanism, commodification, Debord, Société du Spectacle, come out in '67. The geographical locale in the Latin Quarter is very small. It doesn't take much for many students to see a film by Godard, La Chinoise, if it's playing at a theater, word gets around. So this is one of the political features of Paris and France, and accounts for the prevalence of a revolutionary culture. The centralization makes it quite easy to take control of the capital, and then the rest of the country more or less often falls in line. So one of the remarkable facets of May is that this discourse that had been on the margins came to the center and was really able to explain a lot of the political complaints and grievances and phenomena, address it much better than an orthodox Marxist discourse that remained focused on the wage labor capital dyad or traditional problems of production, distribution, etc. Although these were issues too. We probably wouldn't be talking so much, or I wouldn't be talking so much about May '68 at this point had it not. This is what differentiates the French May, the French '68, from all the other '68s in the West. In the case of the Prague Spring, it's of course a different order. But this was a revolt begun by students that was joined by 8 million workers 2 weeks later, resulting in a general strike that brought the nation to a political standstill. So this was unprecedented, which is why it's still such a contested series of events. The opening of the book, the opening few pages, I reflect on the fact that the 60s had become an issue in the U.S. election in 2008, especially with the attempt by McCain to tar Barack Obama for his association with Bill Ayers, even though Barack Obama would have been about 7 years old when the Weather Underground was founded. But why get lost in details and the facts? The facts only weigh you down. And also in the French election, surprisingly, previous year in 2007, between Ségolène Royal, the socialist, and Sarkozy launched into this tirade that was very reminiscent of American conservative diatribes against the 60s as the point where morality fell off the table and the nation ceased to be unified, and so many other problems set in. Sarkozy he copied a lot. This is no surprise. They called him in France until yesterday Sarkozy l'Américain, Sarkozy the American, which is probably half the reason he wasn't reelected. But this he tried to. And Ségolène Royal, who lost 5 years ago, held her last rally, her final rally, in the Charléty Stadium, which was the site of the big socialist rally at the end of May in '68. And the symbolic value was intentional, to show that she was, and her party, were the heirs to this era of contestation that was something to be embraced and celebrated rather than a badge of shame.
Yeah,
which are considerations I wanted to address in the book too.
Yeah, you start the book with this sort of idea that we're still sort of captured in the imagination of '68, that our politics still, in some deep way, revolve around it. And so maybe this is, I have sort of two questions. One, if you want to pursue a little further, it's curious to me that you've described them two explicitly revolutionary ideologies: anarchism, which the first thing you talked about was a critique of the state, and Maoism. But then you also said that they end up being involved in, especially the anarchist party, being involved in a self-limiting revolution that doesn't touch state power, which to me is very curious how an explicitly revolutionary ideology turns into, something like a moderation or a reformist, or I think you use evolutionism in the book. But then the other question I have is sort of what you see as the significant, broad, continuing transformative impact of '68 on the left. You talk about a lot in the book, but if you want to restate for our audience here.
Just quickly about the first point, which I think is important. Some of the upshot of the anarchist currents, which one could describe, I think, and would best be described as a very somewhat abstract and nominal type of anarchism. It wasn't the same as anarchism during the Spanish Civil War. It wasn't explicit political ideology or structure that was interested in creating anarchist collectives, but it was an approach to politics that did emphasize, anti-étatisme or statism, which is the key trope in French politics. To exaggerate a little bit, from Louis XIV to Robespierre. This is Tocqueville's thesis about the revolution. There was more continuity in centralization and state centralization of the revolution than anything else. It's the country of Napoleon, of Charles de Gaulle, and Mitterrand's presidency, which lasted 14 years, is often described as an imperialist presidency, imperialist socialist presidency. So it's a hard trope to overcome. But the legacy of anarchism is, and it's not just anarchism, it's the story of what's called in French the second left, or the deuxième gauche, and it comes from the left Catholic labor union, the CFDT. And the gray eminence is, one of Mitterrand's prime ministers in the late 80s, Michel Rocard, and Pierre Rosanvallon, who's been, was its theorist, who's been much translated to English of late, who came out with a book in the late 70s already, called The Era of Self-Management, l'ère de autogestion in French. So, but the point I want to make, and I tried to make in the book, in the end of the book, regarding the political legacy of May had to do with, I guess it's somewhat of a Tocquevillian thesis, the, again, anti-etatist, anti-statist, or revitalization of French associational life. This allergy to the French political trope of honoring the state and top-down politics was countered through the proliferation of voluntary organizations that emerged to begin with in some of these social movements from the early 70s, which I alluded to before, feminism, gay rights, immigrant rights, ecology movements, that were very concerned that they not be involved in top-down politics and party politics to create alternative spheres of life and political contestation. But now that I mentioned this, the upshot of David Moen, it's a little bit troubling too. So, but this was one of the stories in the 70s. I mean, this has been charted, the upsurge of voluntary associations, and it's continued through the early 2000s. But when Mitterrand was elected, back to my original line about the 7 years of happiness, it turned into something different. But when Mitterrand was elected, there's also a figure in post-war French political history, 68-81, that somehow Mitterrand's presidency was, in ways that are probably difficult to describe or explain, but the sequence of dates sounds good. Somehow 68-81, that Mitterrand's presidency was the fulfillment of many of the aspirations of the Soissons-L'État, the 68ers. It would have been nice if it had worked that way. But many of these protagonists and prime movers of the voluntary associations and these various social movements jumped ship. It was too tempting in 81 and became involved in Mitterrand's administration. And I don't want to be totally cynical about this either, because I think there were a lot of, I mentioned some of the death penalty was eliminated within the first 6 months of Mitterrand's presidency, and the anti-homosexual laws were also right off the bat. So I don't want to be cynical about it at all, but it did really change the structure of political contestation. It was felt that political reform from inside the government and inside the Chamber of Deputies was workable now under a socialist, but it's a mixed bag.
A socialist who ultimately turns neoliberal, right? And so in some sense, what you're describing is the success of the cultural politics of the 60s, but at the same time, a seeming real regression in class politics broadly in Europe, certainly with most working class parties turning into direct heirs, more or less, of neoliberal policies that you mentioned.
Yeah. And maybe I'm just preaching to the converted or telling you something you already know, but what's so different about, it's hard to generalize, but European politics than the US politics is even the main center-right parties, the Christian Democrats in Germany, or the variants of Gaullism from Giscard in France to Chirac, etc. Sarkozy is somewhat of an exception. Really don't challenge, never really challenge the raison d'etre of the welfare state. This is something Democrats would, they now one talks about austerity, etc. And it's a big issue, of course, in Europe with these elections in Greece and France yesterday. And this is front page news now with Merkel. Writing is on the wall. Sure, but you never have the kind of Thatcherite, Reaganite discourse you had. Maybe it's done in at another register, but nevertheless, this is significant. So there are important gradations and differences. But this is what I think the current battles will be in European politics. But they're probably questions of degree rather than substance.
So both the Maoism and the Anarchism were attempts to give sort of left-wing critiques of classical communism and to revivify the revolutionary tradition in the mid-century where things seem to have changed, stultified, etc. Why, sort of what happened to the revolution part of all of it? You go for that. Since that's like central to your book, is that somehow then even the very desire to be truly revolutionary in the mid-20th century ends up getting turned on itself, turns into a very different kind of politics.
Yeah, I'll give you a short answer because it's a difficult and complicated question, especially in France, where, as I said a few minutes ago, the part of national identity, at least identity of Republicans, is tied to these glorious, quote-unquote, glorious events of the revolution, the storming of the Bastille, which is, of course, still the national holiday, the defense of the nation, La Patrie, against the counter-revolutionary armies in 1792 at Valmy. So what's happened is, it's the surprising turn of events, is that what was always coded positively in terms of the heritage of the revolution, and then, as I mentioned a few minutes earlier, had been fused with the Bolshevik Revolution and the kind of the Jacobin Bolshevik lineage of top-down revolutionary transformation, that turned into a negative political coding in the 70s with the revelations concerning the horrors of communist revolutions in Southeast Asia. For example, Pol Pot, of course, in France, this hits home in very dramatic ways, since as French Indochina, this was a former sphere of influence of France, of course, that succeeded.
And also they'd studied a lot of the leaders of the revolution.
Yeah, right. They learned their ABCs of communism in the finest Parisian universities, Pol Pot, Hugh Saint-Pan, in the early 50s. And then the bombshell of Solzhenitsyn's book on the Gulag, which appears in France in 73 and 74. There's a concerted debate over that. So then the whole, in many respects, the whole perception about revolution and the desirability of revolution flips. And this is where you have the emergence of the so-called new philosophers, who are ex-Maoists for the most part, like André Glucksmann and several others. Béachel was never a Maoist. I'm not sure exactly what he was doing in '68. He's probably sitting in a cafe somewhere taking notes and planning his book series or something like that. He claims he was a sympathizer, but be that as it may. But this was a real important sea change and mentality in France. And I tell the story in the book of the way that Foucault as well joins in with Sartre on behalf of the Vietnamese, we called them boat people at the time. In France it was un bateau pour Vietnam. They make an embassy together to the French president, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, to help the Vietnamese refugees fleeing persecution once the North conquered the South. So there's Foucault participates in the late 70s when Leonid Brezhnev had a state visit in France. They have an alternative reception for Soviet dissidents elsewhere in Paris. Foucault is one of the leaders of this, along with Glucksmann, André Glucksmann. So the whole orientation toward revolution just undergoes almost 180-degree switch because of these events of the 70s. I don't know if that's fair or fair-minded. In a way, it's kind of a mirror image of some of the earlier excesses, and it's a form of atonement for earlier credulity toward the virtues of revolution. But that's the way it played out. It was a rite of passage, I think, that French intellectuals had to go through to almost cure themselves of their, Cohn-Bendit made a film in the mid-'80s, which is, well, I don't know if it's available in English, on a tant aimé la révolution. We were so much in love with the revolution, the idea of revolution. But you know, that would only be the film title after the fact, when you're no longer in love with it. So it's an exploration of how things have changed and why.
Yeah, I think you used the term transmission belt. Maoism as a transmission belt. Maybe I'll just ask sort of one more question, and then we can open it up to everyone else. But maybe you want to talk a little bit about the relationship of this book and your kind of tracing the unintended consequences of Maoism and French intellectual history and the kind of, you know, whatever secret Marxist background to the Nouveau Philosophe and the new social movements in France. How that relates more broadly to your work and what you see, you know, the intellectual history you've done about, you know, similarly bizarre trajectories, such as the influence of, you know, Heidegger, a pretty clearly right-wing character, on left-wing thought,
Right.
nominally left-wing thought.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm curious how this book fits in with your trajectory overall.
Yeah, I think in some possibly trivial biographical sense, when I try to figure this out, maybe this isn't the level at which you were hoping for an answer, but I'll come back and hopefully give you the answer you may have been looking for. I think growing up in the United States, I was always frustrated by the narrowness of the political spectrum and the fact that, you know, often when it came time to vote or choose a party affiliation, the differences seemed, times where differences were of course significant. At times the differences seemed infinitesimal. I mean, various shades of liberalism, one more free market, one a bit more sympathetic to considerations of social justice, perhaps. So I was just always fascinated by fascinated and appalled by the political spectrum in Europe, where you really have people on the far left and the far right, and you know, how they got there and what their plans were for political transformation. I think that I spent prior time writing on kind of the far right and Heidegger and Nazism, and then you have this phenomenon, as you mentioned, of kind of Heideggerian Marxism. And how do you figure out that someone like Herbert Marcuse, whom I knew a little bit, or met, studied in Freiburg with Heidegger for 4 years and wrote a Habilitationsschrift, or second dissertation, under Heidegger, and was writing these essays, which actually I edited, in an anthology called Heideggerian Marxism. And what was he thinking? But it's interesting to see what he was thinking and how he conceived this. That Heidegger could be Heideggerianism from being in time could be kind of the missing philosophical link for Marxism, Hegelian Marxism, which was Lukács, kind of too philosophical, abstract, operates you know, at a level of ethereal level, whereas Heidegger's phenomenology of everyday life and being in time, you know, you could actually talk political matters in a way that was more concrete, and that was one of the titles of his important breakthrough essays, kind of a phenomenology of concrete or toward a concrete philosophy. But I think that you know, I'd spent time investigating the ideology of fascism and the far right, and I think for me it was somewhat natural to want to investigate the other side. And then I was I was always fascinated by this strange crucible, or Olympic of the 30s, where you had all these people, some of them aren't household names exactly, on the left, who figured out that communism under Stalin had become something bureaucratic and oppressive and was no longer authentic. But you know, if you became a fascist, or you know, a fascist in Belgium, or a French fascist, you know, with a different, not a Nazi, not you know, because there were supposedly different ways for various fascists, and Mussolini, of course, is the kind of Exhibit A, who started off was the golden boy of Italian socialism until the first year of World War I, where he switched to National Socialism. But this is a same move that there's a great book on three figures on the French left during the 30s. It's called La Dérive Fasciste by Philippe Boulin. It will never be translated because it's a doctoral thesis that's 600 pages. But it's on main figures from the Radical Party, the Socialist Party, Marcel Déat, Jacques Doriot from the Communists, and a figure from the Radical Party as well. And how they switched to making a move to the right, trying to realize their ends of some kind of community and some effective form of socialism, but within the context of the nation, which in a way was the same decision. It's not accidental that Nazi is National Socialism. I mean, Hitler never had that thought, the socialist thought, but his in the first few years of Nazism, there were national Bolsheviks, some of whom he killed in the Rome Purge in '34. But to me, this was always kind of a fascinating trope. The idea of les extrêmes se touchent, left and right, can touch, can cross-pollinate of sorts. And then I was living in France and teaching there actually in 2005 when France, almost exactly 7 years ago, when France, to the day, when France voted against the European Constitution that had been the brainchild of their former president, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. And who was opposing the Constitution? Well, the communists were, the National Front was, and there was a left wing of the Socialist Party led by Laurent Fabius, for reasons I always thought were a bit self-serving, who also, was saying no to Europe. So it was a very strange phenomenon, but by no means unprecedented, and there'll be future precedents as well, or future instances.
So why don't we open it up for general discussion? Again, thank you for coming, and let's, anyone can join in, and I'll just do one question at a time, so each gets a chance to really address them.
I guess what struck me about reading your book was I had this thought, and I like the part where you talk about the cultural ideas and the huge social transformation France underwent. And I guess what struck me was sort of in retrospect, the Janus-like character. I mean, I actually just came from a conference on Jews in the left, which was extremely hostile to those Jews in the left. And the Janus-like character of this historical moment of the 60s and 70s, where it seems like both there is this phenomenon of modernization and transformation, and Maoism in particular seems to incarnate that, in that, on the one hand, it's a form of hyper-Stalinism, and on the other hand, it's the anticipation of the entire postmodern left. And sort of when Maoism disintegrates, that's when you really have a kind of postmodern left. And I think that like one of the other figures we mentioned in that book, particularly in terms of influence on kind of the American academic life, is Foucault. And again, I think the question would be how Foucault's specific experience of particularly the PCF and moving away from the PCF influences the development of this whole thinking. And since you mentioned the Nouvelle Philosophe, one of the points of comparison that I find interesting is talking about Maoism. You compare the Nouvelle Philosophe, who were ex-Maoists, with the neocons, who to some extent, I mean obviously it's been exaggerated, have a genealogy in Trotskyism. Mm-hmm. And I at least find the intellectual genealogy of the neocons much more interesting than the Nouvelle Philosophe, precisely because of that. And I think that the other point that has to be mentioned in that context with Maoism is the element of nationalism. That it seems to me that there was an irreducible element of French nationalism embedded in the attraction to Maoism. Anyway, just general comments about like where that leaves us now, let's say 30 some odd years after 1981, and could you then see that as like the undoing of Marxism as the dominant political tradition on the left? That the 60s is really only a kind of Indian summer of Marxism, but really it's the beginning of
Marxism, and even of, you quote, I think, Francois Fouret's The French Revolution is finally done, which I think he said in 78, 81, something like that.
78. It's the opening line of interpreting the French Revolution. French Revolution is over. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think you're in broad terms you're right, but I think it's not as though, and I try to make this argument, it's not as if these are our only choices. And I'm not sure you were saying that, but it's not as if there was this pristine and intact Marxism that at some level could have solved a lot of the problems. I think that the critical discourse of the 60s, this alternative left-wing discourse, the small reviews, the critique of everyday life, and the discussions of self-management, this was very utopian as well. Hannah Arendt mentions it, Council Communism, after the Hungarian Soviet uprising in '56. This is the point of reference for Cohn-Bendit of sorts. His parents are communists who moved to France in the 30s. And Castriadis' point of reference is also Council Communism. This is the alternative to Stalinism and Leninism. So it's rule of the party over the workers. Well, but I think this is also quite utopian, kind of a better version of it than other forms of Marxism, but not purely utopian. Actually, if you look at what happened in the factories in '68, especially in June, when you had these many factory occupations on behalf of the workers, and then a couple years later, there's a famous lid factory, similar occupation, where the ethos of self-management, or autogestion in French, takes over. I think this is salutary, and I think there was an attempt to graft this approach of self-management or local democracy onto the social movements and the voluntary associations that emerged in the aftermath of May. So there was a heritage, but it also was focused on questions of identity politics and cultural politics, and this had a different tonality. The definition of emancipation, was not what they call in French, le grand soir, the great night where the Red Sea parts and all of a sudden, we're emancipated and utopia is realized. This was no longer the illusion or expectation of what life would be like after the revolution. It became much more differentiated and sober and focused and piecemeal and messy. And some of it was disastrous. If you study what happened, I'll spare you some of the details, but if you study what happened, the internecine battles, this is not unknown in North America either at the time, among French feminists. One French feminist group copyrighted the name of the MLF, Mouvement de Libération des Femmes, and kicked out all the other groups. And of course, there were just infinite. We had kind of an infinite spectrum of Marxisms and gauchistes. The same for feminists. It was incredibly fractious. Say the same of many. It was absolutely excruciating, because on the one hand, many of these political actors and prime movers had come out of a Marxist background. Since de Gaulle had been in office for 10 years, they thought they were living under a dictatorship, and in certain ways they were. So Marxism was the rhetoric of opposition, and then they found themselves under the spirit of the zeitgeist, trying to liberate themselves in terms of their identities, which were also important, which had been neglected. As Foucault, you mentioned Foucault, and it's an important example. Foucault's his greatest experience of repression, aside from everyday life in France, which is why he never lived there, during the 50s. He was cultural ambassador in Sweden and Poland, Tunisia, he was in Tunisia in May '68. It was a much less, oppressive circumstance for him. But yeah, the greatest oppression he probably experienced was when he was in the early '50s a member of the PCF in terms of political intolerance.
I think I was just to say, you have a wonderful anecdote in there where you have, like, Foucault says something to Deleuze, like, we have to overcome the dangers of Freudo-Marxism, and Deleuze says, I'll take Freud, you take Marx.
Let me just clarify sort of like if you looked at like a right-wing caricature of like American academia from the 80s on, in humanities, the idea is it's taken over by a bunch of Marxist deconstructions. And like the paradox of that is if you look at the intellectual content of that deconstruction, if you look at like people who've been hugely influential on supposedly left-wing academic thought, what you find is that people like Foucault and Heidegger represent fundamentally, Foucault in a more ambivalent way, and you think Heidegger in an obvious way, but apparently not, represent actually a reaction and a pushing away of Marxism. And so what's striking to me is that an anti-Marxism has entered a kind of left-wing academic discourse via a discourse that still ambivalently claims some kind of allegiance to Marxism or its tropes or the left. And that's what's the paradoxical thing. That's what comes across in your book is the way Maoism actually seems to be a kind of way station for the abandonment of Marxism. First as a kind of hyper-Stalinist rebellion against Stalinism, but it's a rebellion against Stalinism that's not like anti-Stalinist piece of Stalinism. And then once that disintegrates, it really becomes a rejection of Marxism altogether, because Marxism is identified with Stalinism, and we tried to liberate it from Maoism, and Maoism failed. Therefore, so that's to me the connection between Foucault and Heidegger, who are radically different thinkers.
But I wrote a book on the first phenomenon that you mentioned, namely the strange filiations between these European thinkers like Heidegger, Maurice Blanchot, Gadamer, Bataille, who we think of as kind of staunch leftists or critics, or philosophers of suspicion who we can invoke for radical purposes. I wrote this book that was certainly widely excoriated, and deservedly so, called "Seduction of Unreason," where I pointed to the kind of the dumb fact that and said essentially deal with it. Well, Gadamer was trying to join Nazi re-education camps in the 30s, like a good German. Hermeneutics is nothing very radical. It's all directed against the universalism of the French Revolution. Blanchot at the time, who's kind of one of the forebears of deconstruction. These affiliations are always complex and deserve more careful attention and scrutiny. But he was at a very young age in the 30s. He was the foreign affairs correspondent or columnist for a very right-wing French newspaper. These articles, there were thousands of them, because he did this for about 8 years. This has all been suppressed, and all we know is Blanchot, kind of the novelist, Écriture Blanche. It's somewhat parallel to Paul Demon's case as well, though Demon was a critic. And of course, it was a big scandal. Nazi collaborator in Belgium, also at a very young age. His father, I made the mistake he did when he was unmasked. He was the feuilleton editor, Paul Demon, of a collaboration with his newspaper in Belgium called Le Soir, and for 2 years wrote some terrible articles. But in a way, the reason they're terrible is because they weren't Nazi. You could just kind of reject it as just climbing on board and renouncing your editorial autonomy. They're insightful, fascinating, intellectually rich and dense defenses of why Europe needed fascism. It was a modernist defense of literature too, and why it might be a good idea to send all the Jews to Mozambique. That would be a good idea too. But done in a way. He was only 22. But his uncle, I just have to mention this, was, some of you may know, was depending on what side of the Flamand Walloon line, Henri de Man, Hendrik de Man, who was the head of the Belgian Socialist Party, who also made this flip from left to right has a interesting correspondence with Mussolini during the 30s, and was and was a collaborationist in 1940 after France and Belgium fell, and urged the Belgian king to capitulate and etc. And was tried in absentia after the war, although he only lived in Switzerland. So this is, it's a strange story that, perhaps in Europe wouldn't raise a lot of eyebrows, but this process of transatlantic, crossing is really a little bit eerie. So, I mean, I'm not sure exactly where you wanted to go with that, but I find some of these affiliations, troubling. I mean, I think that when Derrida writes on Carl Schmitt, he should take the time to read, not just some of the Schmitt's works in political philosophy from the 20s, but go into a deeper analysis of what Schmitt is actually calling for in the 20s and where this leads in the 30s. There's a tendency to say, oh yeah, he just 1933 became a Nazi and cooperated with the regime, but this was just to save his neck because the SS was out to get him because he was a Catholic and a latecomer to the party. Well, part of that's true, but if you're going to recuperate the writings of Carl Schmitt for left-wing ends or whatever ends Derrida wanted to recuperate him, you really have to do justice to the nexus between his political philosophy and his belief in the total state of Adolf Hitler. Already in the early 30s, he was writing essays looking with one eye to Mussolini's Italy on the total state and the imperative nature of the total state to overthrow the divided state of liberalism and parliamentarism. So you have to do both levels. I think
Foucault, I mean, also you mentioned only briefly, but Foucault at the same time as he's championing Soviet dissidents is praising the Ayatollah in Iran and telling his students that they should read von Mises and Hayek.
Right.
All three of these at the same time.
Yeah, you read that article about Michael Barron?
No.
I
just read.
Yeah, he has some students who get, but that stuff like that happens. Can I say one thing about? I mean, it's a very supportive chapter and book on Foucault. I came away with a lot of admiration for his ability to, undertake a political learning process and apply the results of '68. Even though he viewed them from afar, his partner Daniel Defer was in fact a Maoist and introduced Foucault to this prison informations group that Foucault basically led for a year that was Maoist run. It was a support group. It started off as a prisoner support group for Maoists who'd been in prison for intellectual work and journalism, who were going on hunger strikes. This was really Foucault's entree. It's kind of ironic, he'd just been elected to the Collège de France, and then he basically did political work solidly for the next year with this prison information group. But the Iran thing is interesting. Of course, in retrospect, it looks like a very sad bet. But it was kind of it's interesting to decipher. It was kind of the last gasp of a different, like a tiers-mondisme, a third worldism that might work, because it wasn't communist and it wasn't political, and it seemed to be indigenous and it was religiously based, not in terms of the dominant political ideologies, but the lesson is, no matter how much you get paid by European newspapers, don't go reporting on political situation if you don't know the language. And just listen to what people are telling you, because it was a poorly judged wager.
But it's intensely anti-liberal. And I was wondering about that because I also think that Foucault's sort of experience in the PCF and then his politics after his response to his experience in the PCF is sort of indicative of a problem. Maybe it's sort of symptomatic of like a a kind of disorientation, not only on the French left, but maybe even in a kind of like post-World War II moment. Janet and Kevin Afari wrote a book on Foucault in Iran, and I remember, there's a disenchantment with not only Marxism, but entire sort of liberal project, and that I think is interesting. That the confusion is so deep, in fact, that what it reveals is the kind of what I would say a kind of it really depends on our definition of Marxism and the kind of politics behind Marxism. That the confusion is so deep, in fact, that there's something really true about the confusion because it begins to do away with the traditions of like liberal radical politics that I think Marxism owes a lot to. And so, because it's interesting also, I wonder about Heidegger's relationship to the sort of colonial movements and things of the sort, because in Iran, this intellectual figure, Shariati, was, educated in Heidegger, and I think that there is something interesting about trying to form.
Who was Khomeini's mentor?
Yeah, and there's something interesting about. He is and he isn't, right? I mean, Khomeini uses Shariati opportunistically. He's not really behind what Shariati wants, but because Shariati didn't want, obviously, an Islamic Republic, but he uses the narrative of Islam to say that there is this fundamental desire for revolution, and one can actually read it in the mythos of the Islamic people, and he thinks of himself as paralleling someone like Fanon. I guess maybe those are just comments, but it struck me specifically about Foucault and Foucault's experience in response to the PCF and the deep confusion on the left in this sort of post-World War II period, and how is Foucault's experience revelatory of the depth of the confusion?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think they were very confusing times, and I think there were a number of options that were foreclosed or that one believed was foreclosed. I mean, one of the constants in French political culture, we're told, or negative constants, we've been told post Furet and other figures, is that unlike Anglo-American political culture, liberalism has never had a firm foothold, and now there's the exception of important 19th century political thinkers like Madame de Staël and Tocqueville, who were rediscovered by the Furetians of sorts in the Gaucher in the late 70s and early 80s, and I got to know some of these people. I know their project was to create, give voice to the liberalism that French political culture always lacked, as the dominant theme being either republicanism, which emphasizes unity at the expense of individuality or difference, or Marxism or leftism, communism. So I think I agree with what you said. I think it was incredibly difficult, challenging, and confusing after May '68, when so many of the conventional political options on the table, in the spectrum, no longer seemed viable. I think Foucault did a very sensitive and creative job of trying to recalibrate those possibilities in terms of his support for the prison informations group and his attempt, to formulate notions of specific intellectuals and even some years later I alluded to, surprisingly, human rights activism. But yes, if he thought about things a different way as well, I mean, perhaps he would have had certain hesitations about Iran. But people tell me that the situation at the onset in the first 6 months, it wasn't really clear the way it would go. There were various factions kind of vying for a voice and for political say and supremacy, and then these got shut down. There were persecutions of Marxists and homosexuals and Baha'i, so it did very quickly.
Well, but Foucault was for the not just sort of for the revolution in the abstract, but he was for the public
theater.
display of self-punishment and he was, for the ritual sort of part of it, he was probably, in my reading, I think he was supportive of the most reactionary components of it, the ones that, led to the poorest forms of politics. And so it's interesting that later on he takes on the sort of human rights narrative because, of course, that requires like a liberal tradition for it to make sense to begin with. And but nonetheless, I think that it is. I think I think that we're in agreement that there is a sense of, I guess, confusion about if to critique the trajectory of Marxism in the 20th century and still somehow remain connected to its most radical aspirations. How does one do that, in this particular period?
Can I push you though on the French liberalism story, because it seems to me that sort of what you were describing, the Ferretian kind of story.
Because it's the binary. It's like it's either you give up on the revolutionary tradition and have liberalism. I mean, the Fourier is like part of the. It's almost as though that Fourier ex-communist, Stalinist, I would say, has to conclude that the solution, the problem of Stalinism, goes back to the terror. I mean, the Robespierre. Robespierre is the ancestor of Stalin.
But I also think this is
Or
an issue.
at least Lenin.
In the 50s, right, broadly liberalism had become like illiberal. Like you could say that the managing, what Adorno called like the administered world, right? That like the broadly like liberalism, even in the United States, had taken on, or in any of the more social democratic countries, had taken on more authoritarian, managing working class discontent character. So it seems bizarre to say this is like a particular problem in France, like we were too Republican, rather than appreciating difference, rather than saying something like what the story of the Frankfurt School was, which was broadly mid-20th century liberalism had really run aground into a kind of soft authoritarianism.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And what's interesting to me is actually the Frankfurt School, which you've written about quite extensively, took a very different political path. I mean, they tried to do a kind of revived Marxism of their own in some sense, although they, I was thinking about the recent Verso publication of the conversation between Adorno and Horkheimer in 1956 about a new communist manifesto, and they have no illusions about China. Like Horkheimer is just like 20 million people dead or whatever. Like we have no truck with China, but they're still calling for Leninism, some kind of party, etc. I wonder, did you hear like echoes of the Frankfurt School in this investigation, or why do you think the trajectories were so very different of like the French intellectuals, say like Sartre, etc., and the Frankfurt School intellectuals, both of whom broadly came from like a humanist Marxist or a sort of self-critical Marxist, anti-Stalinist position? That might be a really
It's interesting. I think that. There's probably grounds to compare Sartre and Marcuse a bit, since they're both indebted to and phenomenology. I think that Adorno, really was never until he got back to Germany an astute writer on political matters. He was always the music critic and philosopher and culture critic for the journal Zeitschrift Sozialforschung in the 30s. Actually, not for a while. He tried to stay in Germany belatedly, strangely, until 35 when he went to England. But he did, when he got back to Germany, he wrote these very courageous, they're translated now, or they've been for a while, in this book called Critical Models. He went on, for all his criticisms of the culture industry, he went on the radio a lot. There have been statistical studies of German public intellectuals who went on TV and radio, and Adorno, he gave these incredibly lucid and powerful political and cultural presentations on Hessische Rundfunk, which is the province where the state where Frankfurt is, on all kinds of questions. What is German? What does it mean to work through the past? And perhaps most importantly, this radio address he gives on working through the past, where he addresses, as almost no German before him had, the problem of confront. It had been basically a taboo subject, Auschwitz and anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. He, in many ways, put this on the agenda. So, I mean, it certainly was an embrace of liberalism, and Adorno was critical of individualism in certain ways, and in this he might have kind of shared a perspective with Sartre. Horkheimer, there are a lot of photos of him with, he was the rector of the university, arm in arm with Konrad Adenauer. Of course, in Germany in the 50s and 60s, you're just in Frankfurt, especially you're miles away from the Oder-Neisse line, what they call when I lived there in the 80s, the Fulda Gap, that's an English word, where if the Soviet tanks are going to pour through toward West Germany, it's through the Fulda Gap that they will go. So you have a very different geopolitical take on communism and Stalinism, and of course the communist regime in the German Democratic Republic was likely the most repressive, or close to the most repressive, of the Eastern European bureaucratic states. So the problem is that in Marxism, which had influenced them all, Marcuse wrote this essay in 1934 on called The Struggle Against Liberalism and the Totalitarian Conception of the State. The last line of the essay was the transformation, I'm approximating, transformation from liberalism to totalitarianism takes place on the basis of the same socioeconomic order. Basically, it's the Marxist argument for fascism as a bulwark against the proletarian revolution or left-wing revolution. This is a last gasp effort by large-scale capitalism to forestall a left-wing takeover by workers. And this is in many ways, if you read Marcuse's essays from the mid-60s during the Vietnam War with repressive tolerance, etc., this is in many ways the mentality that liberalism is, like the Weimar Republic, is weak, and that when it's up against the wall, it's going to embrace dictatorship or something that resembles fascism, which was his interpretation of the U.S. conduct in the Vietnam War, and the repression of dissidents, etc. And he thought he was viewing a replay of the collapse of the Weimar Republic at this time in the United States.
Let's get some more questions.
Yeah, I was just bringing the point. I think on one of the Platypus reading groups, there's an interview with Adorno, and he's asked about the beginning of these student protests, and he doesn't see them as left. He says they remind him of Nazis coming onto campuses and shutting down classes and burning books, and he gets a little hysterical about it, but it's obvious that was his framework, that was always in the back of his mind. But let's get rid of the theory, guys. I'm curious, you talked about how all the anarchist and situationist currents had this profound effect on the Maoists. What did the anarchists do after May 68? Where did they go as far as what they wanted and what they were thinking about?
Yeah, they essentially were involved in social movements, and they edited small publications, became involved either in gay liberation, women's liberation, collectives, groups that explored questions of identity. It was very hard to find a concrete political footing. A lot of mainstream choices had been ruled out for somewhat obvious reasons. Cohn-Bendit wrote a series of reflections, got him into trouble. I think it came out in the early 80s. I don't know if it's been translated in English. It was called La Grande Bazar. At one point, he talks about communes or collectives where everyone went around without clothes on, etc., and there were charges of suspicions of child abuse and such like. But it somewhat devolved into a culture of narcissism as well, and became less forthrightly political. In a way, since conventional options for contestation, party politics had been ruled out, there was a certain self-ghettoization that went on as well, that pursued questions of self-discovery and self-exploration and cultural politics, but had renounced politics at the level of the state or the coalition that had formed in the streets in '68 had well fragmented by that time. So it was a very difficult. Then he moved to Frankfurt am Main in the late '70s, early '80s, which is where I met him and edited a cultural magazine called Flosterstraat, which is an allusion to May '68. You get the saying May '68. Beneath the paving stones lies the beach, because they took the paving stones up to form the barricades. So Flosterstrand is an allusion to paving stones, and Strand is beach. So
to respond really quickly to the Adorno point, because I think Adorno is pretty influential in Platypus's work, but also this actually ties in, I think, to your book. Adorno's one of his big worries about the student movement, I think, was his worry about a certain kind of like anti-intellectual propaganda of the deed character of it, sort of get out on the streets and act, stop what you're talking. And I think it's an interesting thing that comes through your book too, is that one of the reasons that Maoism is actually attractive is this weird sort of, I think you call it like bourgeois self-hatred, that the students like. There's, Maoism has a populist element. It's about, you go to the people, you listen to the people, you don't speak down to them, et cetera, et cetera. So part of part of what attracts is the mass line of Maoism is the sort of anti-intellectual element that's actually part of what oddly attracts the students to it. So in a way, I think Adorno is prescient in some sense, or at least was picking up on a dynamic that I think you point out.
Well, the key word here was used by Habermas in '68 against, or I guess it was later in '67, against Rudi Dutschke. This famous expression he used, for which for a long time, he'd never been forgiven by the German left, of left fascism. And this was a response to this appeal, an anarchistic appeal by Dutschke for gratuitously disruptive acts and provocations that would incite the police to engage you in combat to politicize the somnambulant false consciousness of German society. So it was, really Habermas who stepped in at this point. And, in fact, there were a lot of acts committed. I mean, the famous act in '68 was from Adorno's standpoint, was the occupation by the students in Frankfurt of the Institute for Social Research, the building, when Adorno called in the police and had them thrown out, which for the students was a horror for obvious reasons. I mean, the police, this is in their, blurred political view, this was, the current incarnation of the Gestapo. It was all blurred. The government had no legitimacy. These were, the continuity personnel between the National Socialist era and the government, and some of it was quite true. Former Nazis, and there weren't many choices actually available. Sometimes after the war, as Hannah Arendt once said, when a whole nation is guilty, no one can be punished. There wasn't a lot of resistance in Germany until belatedly, 44 or so, the generals fought. But
and even that was very right-wing.
Yeah, it was self-serving. It was after Germany essentially won the war. It was an attempt to get a separate peace from the Americans. But it needs to be reflected upon and acknowledged that many of the actions by the students or at certain junctures were undemocratic, anti-democratic, and strong-arm tactics. And it is unfortunate that the political spectrum gets blurred. This was Alan Bloom's charge. I mean, I'll never forget it. I thought totally unfair and gratuitous in The Closing of the American Mind that the students of the '60s were merely a variant of Hitler Youth or Nazi youth organizations. So Yeah. Question.
Yeah.
Okay, two questions really. First of all, the influence of Maoism is either bringing together or further disrupting the already sort of fragmented post-56 French left. I mean, even before then, there was a history of French Marxist intellectuals, André Gide, who sort of abandoned Marxism as a political philosophy. There's upheaval with figures like not just Francois Furet, but Henri Lefebvre, who was kicked out of the party, and then Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty, who became disillusioned after the secret speech, and so on. And then the development of specifically anti-Leninist Marxist tendencies like the Situationists. To what extent did Maoism act as a sort of, did it just further fragment the left, or did it actually bind them together? The second question is slightly different, so maybe I'll just ask you to answer that first for now.
Okay. Yeah. Well, as you said, the French left, there was already a spectrum of representatives. What has to be acknowledged is that there was actually a Maoist party in the early 60s after the Sino-Soviet rift of renegades from the French Communist Party, the PCF, who thought that the French Communist Party had become interested in peaceful coexistence, become revisionist, no longer revolutionary. So they were kind of knighted and recognized by Mao Zedong as the official, a very small party, a very strange group. I mean, it's very bizarre. It's very hard to conceive of these people ever attracting a mass following, which they never did. So this is very different than the student Maoists, who were actually kicked out of the French Communist Party youth organization in '66, which is when they started their own Maoist student group. They recognized the bureaucratic and ossified nature of French Communist Party, which had no interest in youth politics or youth culture, and remained very subservient to Moscow. Even in August 1968, when Warsaw Pact troops invaded Prague, the PCF justified it, as did Castro, of course, and what side his bread was buttered on too. So I don't know if they were that influential to kind of further fragment French communism or Marxism. I think that, but later they changed their orientation. So.
Yeah, the second question I had was, I guess, if you see any sort of parallels between the reception of Maoism in France, where, I mean, I think it was much more influential, clearly, and its reception in, say, North America, the U.S. context, etc. Because it seems to me like there was much more of a sort of intellectual, academic afterlife with Maoism in France than there was in the U.S., where it was more of a sort of galvanizing force for activists, as it was to many, many political activists in France also, but it never really attained that sort of institutionalized status of saying, having somebody with the stature of Althusser or Nikos Poulantzas, who was associated with Althusser, and I mean down to this day, as somebody like Alain Badiou, of this Maoism not just like being proclaimed by intellectuals outside of the academies, but within the heart of the French academic system.
Yeah, these were most of them like Badiou, who actually came to Maoism belatedly, not until '69 or so, and Etienne Balibar and a number of the others had been Althusser students at the École Normale, and when Foucault became, it's kind of a funny story, chair late in '68 of this new university that was at Vincennes, right, created by the Gaulle government to get the radicals outside of Paris. They put it on the edge of Paris. This was actually a common mode of urban planning throughout Western society, because they needed new universities, because that's one of the motivations for rebellion. There wasn't enough space at universities, and there was this upsurge of university students that the universities couldn't contain. So they started building universities outside the city to prevent them from demonstrating and pursuing actions within the city confines. But yeah, Foucault, when he came back from Tunis, he was made chair of the philosophy department, and he hired a lot of Althusser's students who were Maoists. And then, according to one of the stories, that because the department was all staffed by Maoists, that the French Secret Service assumed that Foucault was a Maoist, so they started following him around, because fearing that he was like the head of a new Maoist sect. But in a way, this was an excellent mode of containment at the same time. But a very hysterical time politically, both in the comic sense and in the sense of hysteria at Vincennes for all these lecturers. And Deleuze, who was never Maoist, was there too.
But you do mention that the Black Panthers had influence.
Yeah, more broadly, the Maoists, the American Maoists, any parallels, disconnects, between the reception of Maoism in France and its reception in America.
Well, there were dogmatic Maoists in the States, but Maoism was very important for the Black Panthers. And George Jackson was the one really who, in prison, read the works of Mao Zedong and was convinced that if you want to talk about oppression, and Mao talked about the peasants rather than the proletariat as an oppressed group, George Jackson came to the conclusion, well, who could be more oppressed than African Americans? So they were a potential revolutionary subject too. So this is a very important story with the Black Panthers, who were fond of quoting, Mao's maxim that power is found at the end of a barrel of a gun. And so I think that in France the whole thing crashed and burned very quickly. Once exposés came out as to how the Cultural Revolution had gone sour in 1971, the head of the People's Liberation Army, Lin Piao, had attempted a coup which failed, and he died in a plane crash in Mongolia. And then there were memoirs published, testimonies published by emigres, and Simone Leigh's book came out, The Emperor Mao's New Clothes. And gradually, it was a terrible form for many of the French of repetition compulsion, because some had succumbed to the lures of Stalinism in the 1930s, and they were in many ways succumbing to the same lures of the glory, the radiant utopian future that had to exist somewhere. And in fact, the realities were very, very different. And so the whole project of French Maoism, I detail some of this, totally went under ignominiously circa 1972 for a number of reasons. You had the first death of one of the young Maoist militants, Pierre Auvergne, who was killed by a Renault plant guard. And these were they call them in French, the Normaliens they call them, fils à papa. It was like crème de la crème, daddy's boys. And there they were at a demonstration, and one of their fellow Maoists is bleeding to death before their eyes, and they had been urging armed action. Baader-Meinhof was across the Rhine River. This was the big challenge for them if they were to keep the fervor, the revolutionary passion of male life. And it was kind of a make or break point.
You also mentioned the Munich incident.
Right. They'd been allied with a number of the Maoists in France had trained with the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. In Jordan, they had an armed wing called the Nouvelle Résistance Populaire, and then the Munich massacre of Israeli athletes occurred, and many of them, a good number of the Maoists, like Benny Levy, who became Southwest Secretary, Pierre Victor, were Jewish. They never thought of themselves as Jewish. They thought of themselves as leftists and French, etc. But Munich totally changed the way they looked at the world. I mean, either they had been supporting the Palestinian cause for years in solidarity with anti-imperialism, the international left, and then they had to do rapid post-mortem if these were the kinds of acts that they were going to sign off on. The Maoists themselves wrote a very negative and scathing, I couldn't call it scathing, but certainly negative and reserved response in their newspaper, La Cause du Peuple, about Munich, showing all the ways in which it really didn't measure up to their ideology. Sartre, conversely, who strangely, he'd always been very supportive of Israel. In fact, Edward Said has a little autobiographical text. He met with Sartre in the late 70s. It was very disappointing because Sartre was blind at that time. At that point, and Benny Lévy, the ex-Maoist leader under the nom de guerre Pierre Victor, was Sartre's seeing eye dog and tried to convert him to Judaism.
It was a story that he did.
Pardon?
I've heard rumors that he might have.
Yeah, well, he tried, but so Said was very disappointed that he couldn't get to. Sartre was unmovable. But in '72, in this Maoist newspaper, he actually wrote a defense, a justification of the Munich massacre. So there's this kind of disjunction between the real Maoists and kind of Sartre's position on this. So yeah, so the illusions had evaporated very, very quickly. But it's interesting to compare this. We did for a minute what was going on across the Rhine or kind of across the Alps in Italy with the Red Brigades, where there were quite serious acts of terrorism on both the right and the left being perpetrated, and this was kind of the apogee of Baader-Meinhof in Germany too. So the French student left, the Maoists especially, who'd been the ones who always talked a good game and talked about the validity of armed struggle and revolutionism, or a certain hardcore did, long after May '68. It's interesting to compare why this didn't happen in France. It's a trauma that Italy and Germany still work through at times. The kidnapping of Aldo Moro, the Schleier event, this film came out a couple of years ago, the Baader-Meinhof complex. They're still very disturbing events in Germany and Italy for various reasons. And in France, things took a different turn, and it's important to comprehend why. And in the book, I say that France had this history of Republican traditions that suggested kind of an intrasystemic path for political form that, in the last analysis, the French students began to trust in a way that nations with fascist paths and a weak history of institutional change and democracy, like Italy and Germany, they did not have this confidence. And one can almost understand. I just taught a course on terror and terrorism, the second half of which dealt with post-war terrorism, such as Baader-Meinhof and Red Brigades. Given the nature of German democracy and politics at the time, and their concerns about authoritarianism and the continuities in the regimes, there unfortunately was little basis for having confidence in making Germany a viable and vibrant democracy, as in my opinion it has become now. That's the process of a long struggle, and certainly left-wing terrorism didn't make it any easier. It gave the state essentially a chance to trot out the heavy artillery and surveillance, turn it into the police state that the students, their worst fears came true. It was a real nightmare situation in many respects. Yeah.
If we have time for it.
A few more minutes.
I was actually you spoke about the I guess your critique of the students. I want to go back to the question of Adorno, actually, just briefly, because you were saying that the students were, they did a lot of anti-democratic things and were, I think hard line was the word you used. I'm not sure if you meant by that. I mean, I think part of Adorno's critique really had to do with the way in which there was it was something that Jeremy said a while back about a kind of actionism that was completely devoid of theory, because they were calling people professors, using it as a pejorative word. They weren't really interested at all in, say, engaging, say, the history of the left, which might possibly mean thinking about, in the way that, say, Luxemburg and Lenin had tried to think about the relation between theory and practice. I mean, I think Adorno calls it something like organization and spontaneity.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just sort of wondering your take on just if you would also, if this was part, because the students being Maoists, you talked about them being really dogmatic, but part, I think, what often theory, quote unquote theory in Marxist terms, is interpreted in a way as simply like taking some kind of program from the past and imposing it on whatever circumstance one happens to find oneself in, which is a kind of, but I wasn't sure if that was what you meant by the critique of the students, because anti-democratic doesn't seem to totally it doesn't seem quite what Adorno was getting at.
Wasn't quite what Adorno was getting at?
Well, I think there are other, I was partly asking about your take on the relation of theory and practice. Maybe that's more the question, not so much what Adorno was getting at.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, the first thought that popped into my mind was to kind of clarify Adorno's position too. I think it's important to keep in mind that this turning point, 1967, that's portrayed well in the film, the Baader-Meinhof complex, where when the German demonstrator in Berlin, Benno Ohnesorg, is killed by the policeman, turns out we now know was a Stasi agent. This was a real watershed, a turning point in line in the sand, and actually Adorno went on record with a quite positive identification with the students at this time. He was quite supportive in '67. He had these brilliant students with whom he was very close, who were involved in the extra-parliamentary opposition at the time. Oskar Necht, for example, Adorno said when Ohnesorg was killed, he said the students have become the new Jews. So it really wasn't until a later point when things, in his estimation, veered out of control, and you actually put your finger on express the word that Adorno did use, and it's actually interesting to see that more letters have been published. The gap between Marcuse and Adorno. When Adorno died, he was writing on August 6th, 1969. He was writing a letter, in fact, to Marcuse in response to Marcuse's support of the student left. But the word, this kind of mindless activism, and certainly it conjured up ghosts from the German past for Adorno, and those images of, be it right or left, the kind of street fighting and the political chaos that was certainly the pretext and excuse for a Notzustand, a state of emergency, and the imposition of martial law that first happened under Göring in Prussia with the so-called Preußenschlag, or Prussia coup in 1932, when Prussia was ruled by emergency decrees. So this was, Adorno could kind of see this dynamic occurring, whereby lawlessness would call forth the worst features of the authoritarian character in Germany, the authoritarian state in Germany. As feeble as German democracy was at the time, in the years 66 to 69, were the years of the so-called Great Coalition, which was widely considered by the students, and I know that Jürgen Habermas considered this a betrayal of German democracy when the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats get together to exclude any opposition and debate. This Grand Coalition was considered, and they actually passed some, in retrospect, grievous emergency legislation and laws that allowed them to suspend civil liberties because of the rising tide of student protest. So there was a fear that an authoritarian state could, in fact, come into being, and why give them a pretext? So this was the same kind of oscillation between extremes in Adorno's view that could lead to such a bad situation, and some of his instincts. The extra-parliamentary left in Germany, they called themselves, the APO. They were an offshoot of the German Social Democratic Party. They'd been kicked out because of some of their positions, actually. And in retrospect, it was immature politically in a number of respects, and quickly went to the far left side of the political spectrum in I think, a very naive Marxism manner, partly out of frustration. Don't forget there were hundreds of thousands of American troops stationed on German soil, and it was a way station, a transition point for ferrying materiel and personnel to Vietnam, which obviously was extremely troubling. And I mean, I lived in Germany, a while after, in the 80s, when some of these debates were, regarding American imperialism and Reagan were still, in the air and transpiring. And of course, what you encountered quite regularly was the sense of, moral imperative that we, as Germans, as heirs to the Nazi era, as the sons and daughters of the perpetrators, have a moral imperative to not let it happen again, and to stand up and fight somehow to the best of our abilities the political repetition that is at risk in this era. So it was just real quick. It was very, if you were German, if you were anyone, but especially in Germany, there was just such an overdetermination of the political past and these ghosts from the past. So few really good political choices and options available, and such confusing political times. I think it was very difficult, if not almost impossible, to take some kind of reflective and sober political position. The insanity of having the middle-range nuclear missiles, the SS-20s on the East German side, and the cruise and Pershing missiles, which a social democratic Prime Minister Helen Schmidt had signed off on in alliance with Reagan in the early 80s. You have this absolutely surreal situation of nuclear overkill on both sides, but basically the only people who are going to die are Germans. I mean, they'll be absolutely annihilated. So is this a secret plot to have revenge against the nation that unleashed World War II, that caused so much misery? I mean, this was I'm just kind of, telling you the kinds of things that I was hearing. This is a plot by America and the Soviet Union to eliminate Germany and Germans as a nation, retaliation. But it sounds fantastic, and it seemed to me fantastic at the time. But again, I don't want to go too far with empathy or putting yourself in the shoes of the other. I mean, I think it's a good ethical practice. But it was a terrifying situation, and the Germans had no control over who was going to push those buttons. It was either going to be the Soviets on one side, or NATO, basically the American generals, on the other side. So it's a pressure-filled situation to live under.
Was there anyone else who had a question?
just a follow-up on the American and French legacies of Maoism. One common thread, even though it never had the sort of academic impact in America that it did in France and amongst later notable intellectuals, Maoism does seem to have this sort of affinity with identity politics in both contexts. I wonder to what you would attribute that. What is it about Maoism ideologically that lends itself to these kinds of particularistic models of politics?
Well, I'll try to be quick. I'm not sure I agree with you about Maoism in particular. I think this is why Badiou, who seems to be the French philosopher du jour, or has been for a few years now, is an interesting case because what he claims to be faithful to the universal and to the legacy of early Christianity, Jacobinism, and Bolshevism, and Maoism, because he doesn't succumb to the lures of identity politics, cultural politics, except postmodernism, this fragmentation of the left. He's going to be above all this. He's going to be the one who's faithful to the legacy of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin. We'll leave that name drop. Things didn't go so well then, but and Mao of sorts, because Mao is the last one who tried to preserve the legacy of a genuine, universal proletarian, peasants for Mao revolution that was free of Badiou believes in the universal and universalism, and he's really the last one to hold this banner high. So I think if you're a faithful Mao, and it's making it come back in China a little bit too in weird ways, because there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the gap between rich and poor in China, and that they've gone too far. Why are we a communist nation if we're really interested in economic growth rates, et cetera, and world trade and et cetera. So there is a contingent. For example, the recently discredited party official Bogilat, been in the news, was really trying to recreate a kind of Maoist collectivity of sorts, and a lot of it was selective and pastiche-like, singing Maoist songs, but this criticism of corruption and very concerted prosecution. I mean, it looked good in the papers, and so I don't really know if Maoism in its pure forms is really conducive to identity politics. So.
I'm curious, this is a sort of related question, and then maybe one final question, we'll end there. But a sort of related question, I'm curious is why you think in France in the 60s, but also more generally in the 60s, a sort of potentially other anti-Stalinist tradition, which would be Trotskyism, didn't have more sway? Because, in the 30s, obviously, right, I think at one point in the book you mentioned that Maoism was, I'm trying to remember, it was like, Maoism was appealing because of culture, because of civilization, and because of something else. I forget what the third one was. But, in the 30s, obviously, for a lot of people, Trotskyism became appealing for broadly cultural reasons, right? Trotsky writes a manifesto with André Breton and Diego Rivera, and he is, he writes a book on the problems of everyday life, and et cetera. So in the U.S. context, those who wanted to escape socialist realism, who wanted to escape Stalinism, often moved into sort of Trotskyism circles. That seemed to be much less the case in the 60s, where you seem to either get, the critiques of Stalinism tended to be either from a generally anti-Marxist point of view, like the anarchist point of view, or a ultra-Stalinist point of view. So I'm curious why things sort of turned out that way in your view.
Well, true, with one important qualification. Let's not forget that there is a strong history of French Trotskyism, and it's been very powerful from an electoral standpoint too, in weird ways. Let's not forget that 10 years ago, 2002, there were in the presidential election in the first round, Trotskyist candidates, Arlette Laguiller, who was the leader of this Force Ouvrière, got over 5%, close to 6%. The communists, real communists, got like under 2. But other Trotskyist candidates, along with Laguier, polled close to 10% of the vote. And in the interim, then, I mean, Laguier was old guard. So they had this very charismatic, youthful Trotskyist who didn't run this time. Maybe you've read about him. The Nation did a good story on him about 4 or 5 years ago. Olivier Besançon, very, very youthful, telegenic, and represented the workers in a way that the communists had ceased to do. So Trotskyism has had this, strange power perseverance, kind of as a citation, as an alternative, as a, kind of its otherness factor, as a protest vote as well. But the real problem with Trotskyism gaining a political foothold is that Trotsky himself never bought this line about the peasants or Trotskyists being potential revolutionary class. He was always trying to remain faithful to the idea of the working class, the proletariat. And in the era of the 60s and third worldism and the wretched of the earth and peasant communism as the new figure as a result of the Chinese Revolution, Trotskyism just seemed to a lot of people out of sync, and a bit of an atavism. And I think, despite the fact that for the reasons you mentioned, because of Trotsky's, erudite and literate friends and friendships, certainly he had a certain currency and attraction among intellectuals. Even Sartre, when he was a fellow traveler of the Communist Party, if you look at his positions, in many respects they were very Trotskyist. I mean, Leninist, Trotskyist, it all kind of blends together at a certain point. But they were, the Fourth International really never got off the ground, never had more than a couple thousand, a few thousand supporters really. It was a position embraced by intellectuals, but when it has no working class support or basis. I mean, I was just actually reading for some work I was doing on socialism and barbarism, some of the early texts by Claude Lefort, trying to get the sense the spirit of the debates of French Trotskyism after World War II and in the late 40s when Lefort was actually the member of a Trotskyist party before he started Socialisme et Barbarie. And they're fascinating but totally deluded. I mean, just like Trotsky was deluded about, it was like any minute now, they're going to throw off Stalin and realize that I'm really Lenin's heir. This is what they're waiting for. This has to be the case because this is written in history and it doesn't make sense. History doesn't make sense. It's not rational otherwise. The French Trotskyists, some of the names are actually, well known in France. The fact, but they were all factionalized too. They had these splits. So you have a faction of only 120 Trotskyists to begin with, who split up into groups of 18. So then your chances are even worse. But it really is sobering from the standpoint of political sectarianism and the delusions to which, of course, looking back, it's easy to see, but it was very, very out of touch in many ways. So.
And I guess sort of to end on, you end the book talking about how the 60s, in your view, sort of expanded the idea of social emancipation. So emancipation had, in your view, in traditional Marxism, been very narrowly conceived as something like socializing the means of production or taking power from the state. And I guess, broadly, I think I have some historical questions about that because, I think certainly, the German Social Democratic Party, for instance, defended homosexuality or et cetera. I think there's a more mixed history about social libertarianism and especially older Marxism, but more generally,
even feminism too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like a staple. But I think more generally, I guess, do you think, in the period since the time you're talking about, from the 60s to the present, do you think our sense of social emancipation, about what's possible in terms of human freedom, has expanded, has really advanced in a profound way, or is the story more mixed? I'm kind of curious maybe to end with a meditation on this. Like, where do we stand in relationship to social emancipation today?
That's all?
Yeah.
What about Richard Wolin? Well, I actually, it's funny that you asked that question, because in a way I was trying to respond to this issue or give a take on it in my abbreviated introductory remarks. And I think that it's just a totally different world in the formulation of issues and questions of emancipation and freedom as they were conceived, say, in the 19th century under the working class movement and under social democracy. Just it's totally changed and pluralized, and therefore it's become a lot more difficult and multifaceted. What it would mean to we no longer have a simple answer. I mean, my answer would be something like a multi-tiered, multi-layered approach to democracy that works at a number of levels, that works at a grassroots level, a legal level, a constitutional level, a parliamentary level, a level that would regulate economic flows considerably, a level that, in solidarity with the early Habermas, stresses the importance and vibrancy of a public sphere as a feedback mechanism and as a basis for discourse, but we can see that public spheres have fragmented and that public discourse has real problems of keeping mass media at arm's length and preventing them from becoming this universal conduit that settles all issues in very superficial ways. So I think that there is the need for constant mediation vis-a-vis political and economic authority in ways that demand a lot of imagination and rethinking. And it's not as if there's one movement or one institution or one particular reform that's going to solve our problems, because our issues have themselves are thinking about emancipation, what emancipation constitutes and means, has become pluralized in so many senses that we have to remain on our toes in politically and socially and culturally in so many respects that it's almost a demand for constant vigilance. And this means that so many of these even nice conceptions of democracy, going back to someone like John Dewey with the public and its problems, is also, in retrospect, it's noble, but it's somewhat utopian. It's just really not that simple anymore, and that really demands reflexivity and attention at a number of different levels. So, I don't know if that's an answer at all. Or
Meditation, which is what I asked for.
But I think that's kind of the only way to go.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you.
For being here. Thank you, guys. And please take food home. There's lots of it. And sign-up sheets are in the front, so are book order forms. People want to order copies of the book. And usually we go out for drinks to a place near here, so if people want to imbibe and talk about Maoism as well. Come hit it.